The topic of tonight's debate is going to be the resurrection is a historical event. Than will argue that the resurrection is more probable compared to its competing hypotheses, and Matt will be holding the opposing view.
I also hold an opposing view.
For those of you that came here hoping for a bloodbath, because I know a lot of people were, sorry to disappoint you, but I'd rather have this mutual, loving pursuit of truth that Matt and I had here today over one of us trying to destroy each other.
Well, I wasn't invited, so bring on the bloodbath. Just kidding. I also like a pursuit of truth, but that doesn't benefit Than. Welcome to Paulogia, where a former Christian takes a look at the claims of Christians. Not long ago, friend of the channel Matt Dillahunty had a live, in-person Easter resurrection debate against frenemy of the channel, Than Christopoulos. Now, while I'll never be as skillful or practiced in debates as Matt, and I thought he handled himself extremely well in this one, I found myself reacting strongly to Than's opening statement on details that didn't ultimately return to center focus in the discussion. He went in quite a different direction than Gary Habermas's minimal facts, so I wanted to address those here with the benefit of hindsight, extended time, and a pause button. First, let me say I think Than is a really nice guy. We've had some very pleasant interactions. He handled himself really well in this debate. Let's go.
Tonight's debate is about the resurrection of Jesus, and before I get into that, I need to hit on some preliminaries that will help us put everything together. After that, I'm going to present 4 main points. The first and main point, the probability that the resurrection happened is higher than the probability of its competing theories. That will be argued in light of 3 other main points. The prior probability of the resurrection is not too low to overcome with a reasonable amount of evidence. Point 3, the New Testament is historically reliable and contains what the eyewitnesses to the resurrected Jesus originally said. And then lastly, the combination of the evidence from the testimony of the eyewitnesses and the other historical considerations favors the resurrection.
Than's presentation, and indeed his ministry as a whole, from what I can tell, is enamored with Bayesian analysis.
Forget about the gospel for a second, I want to indoctrinate you into the Bayes.
Which I will not be addressing. For those unfamiliar, Bayesian analysis is a quantification and mathematical description of presuppositions and natural decision-making processes. I'd encourage you to watch the full debate for those points and counterpoints. Sideshow window dressing aside, ultimately the important question is this.
What are the odds of the evidence if the event occurred?
3,720 to 1. Never tell me the odds.
What are the odds of the evidence if the event occurred? And what are the odds of the evidence if the event did not occur?
Exactly. What are the odds of the evidence? Let's spend less time talking about the odds and more time on the evidence.
Here's the basic idea. Prior probabilities are important because they tell us how strong the evidential case needs to be. If the prior probability is low, then we need a high strength of evidence. If the prior is high, we only need a little bit of evidence. The prior probability of the resurrection will be a conjunction of 2 things. The probability that God exists.
Oddly, this is the exact opposite approach of resurrection scholar Mike Licona. Mike insists that because history cannot tell us who resurrected Jesus, his persuasive efforts should focus on the event itself and ignore such presuppositions.
Please notice that I did not appeal to God as the cause of the resurrection. I tried to keep this all worldview independent, worldview neutral, and just look at the facts and say, all right, I'm not going to appeal or presuppose God.
But Than admits that my acceptance of a resurrection hinges on the probability that God exists, but proceeds to spend no time on the question of God's existence. For those of us coming in skeptical of God, he's aware that everything else he says is going to be very difficult to accept.
And the probability that God would want to raise Jesus.
First, if I don't think God exists, this is entirely ascribing desires to a fictional character. What's the probability that Thanos would want to eliminate half the population? What's the probability that Peter Pan would resist growing up? And even if you could first move me to a theistic conceit of a creator being or beings, no other God-based religion through history thought God would want to raise a being from the dead. Hundreds of thousands of years of humanity having entirely different intuitions about what God would or would not do. According to the Gospels, even the disciples didn't think this ahead of time. Everyone who's come to this conclusion has done so post hoc rationalization, looking backwards.
Richard Swinburne, professor of philosophy at Oxford, has put forth a strong case that if God exists, he would perform a miracle like the resurrection of Jesus. And he does this in 3 steps. Here's the basic idea. If God exists, he's perfect.
Why? Countless cultures have believed in incredibly imperfect gods. Why should I trust Swinburne's intuition over theirs?
If he's perfect, he will pursue the best kinds of actions. Swinburne then lays out why an incarnation would be a best kind of action. And broadly speaking, he gives 3 reasons. One reason would be to provide atonement for humanity's wrongdoing. Given the finitude of humanity, we're subject to moral failure and death. Because of this, we need a way to make amends, but given our finitude, we lack the ability to do this. God, being a perfect being, would then become incarnate to perfectly defeat sin and death on our behalf.
That doesn't sound remotely like a perfect God to me. A perfect God couldn't be harmed in any way by any action of a created being. So none of this atonement would be necessary in the first place. Alternately, a perfect God capable of forgiveness is capable of forgiveness without any contrition on behalf of the offender. I've forgiven all kinds of people and grievances without being asked. Alternately, a perfect God who is capable of creating a heaven where no one wants to sin is capable of creating an earth where no one wants to sin. Alternately, a perfect God doesn't need to punish non-followers for eternity. He can just make them disappear. Alternately, a perfect God knows in advance who will freely follow him and who won't. So he can just not create the ones who won't freely choose. And most important of all, a perfect God would absolutely not rest the heaven or hell, bliss or torment, eternal future of beings he claims to love on such a fragile notion as intellectual assent of a proposition of any ambiguity. If knowing that God exists is the necessary prerequisite for even choosing salvation or not, then I cannot fathom a perfect God that doesn't make it undeniably obvious. There's a long list of Bible characters with allegedly perfect knowledge of God, including Satan, who still rejected him. So this has nothing to do at all with free will. Swinburne's intuitions about God could not be further from mine. So if I'm supposed to include my intuitions about a being I already don't see demonstrated into my resurrection probability calculus, then Than's burden of proof just got much more difficult than it was before the neutral position I came in with.
After that, Swinburne argues that we would expect that God incarnate's life would include some of the following features because they would be the best possible kinds of actions. This list includes, but is not limited to, telling people that he is God incarnate and that he will provide atonement, founding a community to spread and pass on this news to all cultures, that he would most likely authenticate his claims by some kind of miracle, something that would make it obvious that his claims were true.
It is clearly not obvious, or we wouldn't be having this debate. No one's eternal fate would rest on the question of God. We'd all move to accepting or rejecting the undeniably existent God. I would absolutely not expect a perfect God who wants to have a relationship with me to leave that to late hearsay rumors of anonymous people from thousands of years ago. Listen, I'm open to the notion that maybe that's what God did, but that could not be further from my personal expectation. Appeal to expectation is an incredibly dangerous line of rationalization to present to anyone who isn't already on Team Resurrection.
And lastly, he argues that Jesus is the only candidate that fulfills these expectations, putting Jesus in a unique category. So this isn't just some random guy. This is a man whose life has changed the world in ways that we all take for granted.
Unsurprisingly, Matt pointed out this disparity in his and Than's expectations about God's reasons and motivations. Remember, Than is arguing for a high
probability that God would want to raise Jesus.
And when God's reasons and motivations are unclear to us,
and then we ignore the parts of the story that don't make sense because, well, God's got his reasons, or we'll find out later, or God's ways are not our ways.
Which is it then? Do God's motivations align with our intuitions about expectations, or do they not?
So if this is what happened, this would be the most single important event in history. So why is it even subject to debate? Now, one thing that I might say is Matt is making an implicit claim here, and that is that if God exists and this is real, he would want this to be presented in a way that's just provable, not debatable. After all, perhaps, though, God might have good reasons for wanting this to be in the epistemic middle ground, giving us enough evidence to warrant or justify belief, but not such that it forces belief.
Than started by building a case on an appeal to God's clear motivations, but later retreats to acknowledgement that God has unclear motivations, even to Than.
People will often kind of call these things excuses rather than reasons.
That's excusogenics.
Supports his existence, but not so much that it forces belief. So for instance, I would consider what we're doing here a really valuable thing, right? We're sitting here, and philosophers like to talk about the true, the good, and the beautiful, right? The alethic domains, the moral domains, and the aesthetic domains. Alethic is like truth value, truth-finding domains. It seems like the conjunction of God's existence in some sort of value theory would predict something like God wanting a world where we're sitting here and having these really valuable conversations.
I'm sorry. My eternal fate relies on clarity about whether God exists, the so-called perfect God, can't give me that clarity because he really thinks it's beautiful when people have conversations? That'll sure be a comfort to Matt and me in hell, that the people at this church were able to enjoy a nice conversation. Are you kidding me? Look, ultimately none of this has any relevance in convincing a skeptic of the resurrection. If it happened, show us that it happened, and I'll absolutely reconcile with these entirely counterintuitive reasons the Bible claims for it. Fine. But Christians, you should definitely drop this line of reasoning with a non-believer. At best, it's saying that if you already think a resurrection is likely, then you're more likely to believe in a resurrection. At worst, you're going to come across as tone-deaf and entirely unsympathetic to anyone in your audience who's open to believing in a resurrection, but is so far unconvinced that you honestly believe God is justified in preventing me from making an informed decision about him so that others might enjoy the pleasantries of a nice chat, comes across as heartless and disconcerting.
So while I find the evidence supportive of God's existence, let's, in the spirit of modesty, consider a neutral stance on that topic.
After all that preaching to the choir, we'll just concede neutrality.
Then the prior probability of Jesus' resurrection wouldn't be so low that it couldn't be reasonably supported by evidence.
I agree. There's no point in even having a conversation with someone whose prior probability is so low that it can't be overcome with evidence. I promise that mine is not. Sufficient evidence would definitely be sufficient to convince me. But I can tell you what kind of evidence, at least on its own, could ever convince me of something supernatural. Testimony.
There's a lot of different things we can point to, but the main thing I want to focus on today is testimony. For anyone skeptical of this, consider that there are people that specialize in epistemology, the study of knowledge, and we have a subset of that study called the epistemology of testimony. The philosophers who focus on this are not rejecting testimony as evidence.
I'm not saying I reject all testimony, or that testimony isn't evidence. What I'm saying is that testimony will not, and should not, be sufficient on its own to establish a miracle. All testimony is potentially deliberately falsified in some way, and also potentially honestly mistaken or misattributing, or even a combination of mistaken and falsified. That someone is lying or someone is mistaken is always going to be more likely, even if a real God is really actively involved in people's day-to-day lives. The divine intervention explanation is always less likely than the mundane explanations.
So if testimony is valuable evidence in our everyday lives, it can therefore be evidence for whether or not a miracle happened.
It can be evidence, but is entirely insufficient without other types of evidence in the mix. Again, testimony alone is exaggerated or false every day. Testimony is mistaken every day. False or mistaken is highly likely, making testimony alone insufficient. I'm not saying miracles don't happen. I'm saying testimony alone cannot establish one. Spoiler alert, nothing but testimony will be on offer today.
I want to stress that even if I grant a low prior for the resurrection, it doesn't mean the resurrection isn't more probable. My case does not hinge on this because we still have to evaluate the evidence itself. As you'll see, we have a lot of evidence and the force of the evidence we have is very strong.
Okay, let's get on with it.
I will be arguing for the reliability of the New Testament. To be clear, this is not me saying that the New Testament is reliable, therefore the resurrection happened. This is me saying that the New Testament is reliable and that therefore we have access to what the eyewitness accounts originally said, which will therefore serve as evidence in favor of the resurrection.
Well, that's problematic, because even if it is testimony, I've been pretty clear that testimony alone is going to be more likely to be lying or mistaken than sufficient affirmation of the miraculous. But while we're here, let's consider this assertion of gospel reliability.
So why should we think this? Two things. First, we have internal evidence that shows that the New Testament contains the texture of historical documents that include reliable eyewitness testimony and intends to portray accurate history. And then we also have external confirmations, which showed the authors got hard things right, things that someone who was not close to the facts would have a hard time replicating or making up.
Did you know that there are many ancient books that give every appearance of intending to relay historical information and biography, and yet contain supernatural elements? As just one example, Plutarch's Lives, a series of biographies of famous Greeks and Romans, are valued as historical sources, yet they contain the divine parentage of Alexander the Great, the miraculous birth of Romulus, Julius Caesar's encounters with supernatural beings, and goddess Athena securing a war victory for Themistocles. Do historians suggest that elements and details from Plutarch that can be corroborated as coming from someone close to the facts should lend credence to Alexander's divinity? No. Historians evaluate each claim on its own, trying to separate echoes of facts from dramatization for moral and philosophical purpose, listing cities and regions, wars, battles, treaties, and political alliances, religious practices, festivals, ceremonies, and philosophical schools that align with external sources does nothing to affirm that Romulus was taken up to heaven in a whirlwind.
First, let's consider the authorship of the Gospels. Our Bibles contain 4 Gospels labeled with the names of the 4 traditional authors. This is important because if this is the case, then we have documents written by 2 eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus, as well as 2 documents written by people close to the people who were eyewitnesses to the risen Jesus. And there's a few tests we can use to confirm the identities of the authors.
It's too long to get into here, but see my video, Who Really Wrote the Gospels, for a brief case as to why traditional gospel authorship is highly dubious and incredibly unlikely. The evidence suggests that the names Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John came into prominence between 120 and 180 AD, not from the start. Than's slides talking about traditional authorship after this time.
From 180 on, we have strong and consistent external attestations of who wrote the Gospels.
Merely underline that prior to 180 AD, we do not have authorship clarity.
This is before the internet, the printing press, and Christians were a persecuted minority. Travel was dangerous and expensive, yet we have a geographical spread of universal attestation, all in agreement of who wrote the Gospels in the early church, as you can see on this map. The documents also contain data that would be surprising if they were not written by the people scribed.
Than's opening statement relies heavily on the word surprising, which is an emotional judgment call. All the men mentioned on this map were writing in the post-attribution time frame, except Papias, who shouldn't be on this map at all because he doesn't attest to the author of our Gospels at all. See my videos. That the men who wrote after attribution emerged agree on the attribution that emerged is incredibly unsurprising and doesn't tell us that they're agreeing on something true. That's begging the question, assuming your conclusion.
Here are some quick examples of this. Matthew, an alleged tax collector, was clearly focused on money.
The people in my life who are most money-focused in their passions and conversation are not people who work in finance-related fields. Money is important to literally everyone. None of these best-selling finance books were written by people who work with money as their primary occupation. You know what is surprising about the Gospel of Matthew? That the story where Matthew meets Jesus, presumably one of the most important events in Matthew's life, is copied from Mark, someone who wasn't even there, rather than using his own words or using first person. That's surprising.
John shows knowledge of Palestinian geography.
The author of a story set in Palestine has knowledge of Palestine, is surprising, and points to a specific individual.
Mark, who is writing down Peter's words, shows knowledge of first-century Jewish customs and has Peter front and center in his gospel.
Knowledge of Jewish customs by the author of a book about a Jewish cult? Unsurprising. If my minimal witnesses hypothesis is correct, Peter is literally the first Christian from whom all others sprang. So the earliest written account, being Peter-centric, is also entirely unsurprising.
Luke, who was a doctor, was written by someone who was trained in physician's terms.
The author of Luke is universally agreed to not be an eyewitness to the life of Jesus, and explicitly reports that he's compiling information from an array of sources. So, when this gospel contains physician terms, we can just as well conclude that among the author's sources was physician-aware writing. Than's slide itself shows us what those sources might have been. And this wasn't jargon, not unfamiliar to the general population. Just like money, health is something most people have some level of concern and familiarity with. Not to mention this notion of Luke being a doctor comes from even later sources most scholars agree are forged. See my video. This becomes pretty unsurprising.
These next few points are a little textbooky, but they're important, so bear with me here. The accounts read just like you would expect if they were early, accurate historical accounts based on eyewitness testimony. For example, look at Luke's opening. This is a translation by New Testament scholar Luke van der Wijk.
I have no idea why Than put up this slide, as even this translation makes it clear that Luke is writing out of the emerged oral tradition rather than any one-on-one interviews. Accounts delivered to us means he's no better informed than the general knowledge of the community.
And as he points out, scholars also compare Luke's approach to historical reportage with that of other ancient historians. Luke's gospel uses language like accomplished among us and refers to eyewitnesses delivering accounts to us, indicating an informed familiarity with the events. And we can also look at how Luke writes just like historians of his time.
Again, historians of his time included supernatural embellishments that no modern historian takes seriously. I'm the one treating the gospel the same as other literature, where Than is looking for special pleading.
Next, scholars widely agree that the author of Luke is also the author of Acts. Regarding Acts containing eyewitness accounts, scholars often cite the we passages starting in Acts 16:10. Here, the author uses the word we in a way suggesting personal involvement in the events described.
A few places where the self-proclaimed multi-source author uses the word we may also suggest that someone's personal travel log was among his sources, or he used personal insertion for dramatic effect. In either case, even taken at face value, the we passages take place decades later and far away from Jesus' alleged resurrection.
Moving on from just internal cues, we also have many external confirmations. For example, classical historian Colin Hemer wrote a meticulous book, and in it he presents 84 factual confirmations that bolster the credibility of Acts.
Minor corroboration with general setting is unsurprising, and particularly unrelated to the resurrection, when the examples are from faraway places and faraway times from Jesus' death. From the examples on Than's slide, does familiarity with citizenship procedure, well-known wind patterns, or local superstitions in any way lend credence to his third-hand at best repetition of community beliefs about a miracle? Seriously? If I have a written account of a dragon in a local park, am I going to find that aspect believable because the author mentions the name of a regional convenience store chain, that the local town council members are called aldermen, and that there's sometimes still snow in March, and over 80 more details just like these? No, I'm not.
Another external confirmation of the Gospels comes in their form of knowledge of personal names. This is known in the relevant scholarship as onomastic congruence.
Okay, well, see this 90-minute video I did with the authors of this peer-reviewed paper on the fundamental flaws and failures of personal name research to form statistically relevant conclusions.
And now I want to reiterate, I'm not saying the New Testament's reliable, therefore the resurrection happened. What I am arguing again is that the New Testament's reliable, and that includes the accounts represent what the original alleged eyewitnesses actually said.
You can make no such conclusion. At best, you can make the case that the gospel authors were reliably recording whatever stories were circulating at the time. But even then, it's impossible to rule out the broad creative license afforded to all historians of the day. Nothing about the Gospels requires them to be rooted in eyewitness testimony. They themselves suffer the same flaw. They are definitionally more likely lying or mistaken than to be accurately recording extraordinary events.
Because I've argued that the New Testament is reliable, that leaves us with two theories that actually can compete with the resurrection, that either the eyewitnesses were lying or they were mistaken.
Keep in mind that the category of lying includes exaggerations, and that the category of being mistaken includes believing and repeating said exaggerations. It is scholarly consensus that the Gospels represent the writing down of oral traditions about Jesus, passed along person to person for decades, growing and adapting with each telling in an attempt to convince doubters to become converts. It is unsurprising for evangelistic narrative evolution to preserve a few core factual details, even over thousands of repetitions, or for new false points of verisimilitude to be mixed back in, even subconsciously, by ideologically motivated enthusiasts. So again, we are not granting that the Gospels are grounded in testimony, but let's move on with Than to that fundamental flaw of testimony.
After Jesus died, he was shortly thereafter buried in the tomb of Joseph of Arimathea. And as a reminder, we've established the reliability of the New Testament, and the empty tomb is attested multiple times.
Than claimed that this section of his opening would be an evaluation of whether the Gospels might be lying or mistaken about resurrection, but now asserts the Gospels cannot be lying or mistaken about the empty tomb for some reason. Why can't they be lying or mistaken about an empty tomb? If you have a reason why they can't be lying or mistaken about an empty tomb, just use that reason to say they can't be lying about resurrection, and your job is done. If you insist that the Gospels can't be wrong about one thing, because that would contradict what the Bible said about another thing, you're pretty much in the land of... And for anyone asking why I might accept death by crucifixion and not empty tomb, reasonable question. Thousands of Jews were killed by crucifixion, and history records only one surviving the ordeal, and that with advanced medical help. So it's a mundane claim with little proselytizing purpose, and I'm convinced is sufficiently corroborated by Tacitus. Your mileage may vary. On the other hand, a one-of-a-kind, legendary, fluid burial circumstance for Jesus that goes dramatically against standard practice for Romans, for family, and for religious leaders is decidedly non-mundane and dripping with narrative necessity. It's not completely implausible, but it sure isn't in the realm of usual.
The Jewish leadership was not happy with this movement, and they could have easily produced Jesus' body to stop it from progressing. But this never happened. The location of the tomb would have most likely been known by most people as well.
I object, Your Honor. Question assumes facts not already in evidence.
Objection sustained.
Most crucifixion victims ended up in unidentified, unremembered locations. To insist that Jesus would most likely end up in a known location is going to require a lot more than Than's question-begging say-so.
It was also discovered by women, marking them as the first witnesses to the resurrection. This is significant because first-century Jewish Palestinian culture had a low view of the testimony of women, specifically their testimony to miracles and divine revelations. For instance, Jewish law often disregarded the testimony of women, considering it unreliable due to the boldness of their sex. Their words, not mine. And as you can see, there's references on the screen again. This satisfies the criterion of embarrassment, which is a principle used by historians to assess the reliability of historical accounts. It suggests that if an embarrassing or socially awkward detail is included in a narrative, especially one that would be detrimental to the author's or group's credibility, it is likely to be authentic rather than fabricated.
The criterion of embarrassment is almost exclusively contained to the realm of New Testament studies, because broader scholarship recognizes that embarrassment is highly subjective and culturally driven, such that we cannot reliably identify what would or would not have been embarrassing. It's also a well-used tack to specifically include embarrassing details in a story in order to make a lie seem more plausible. It's uncontroversial that women were a key factor in the spread of early Christianity, so this was obviously an evangelically effective subversion of normal power dynamics that made half of the population feel particularly included. Christianity wasn't being tried in court, it was being pitched in households and in the marketplace.
Next is the testimony of the postmortem appearances of Jesus. People claimed to have experienced encounters with him after his death.
Objection, assuming facts not in evidence.
Sustained.
None of the postmortem appearances of Jesus in the Gospels are first-hand accounts.
The witnesses are not uniform groups of religious zealots. They're from diverse backgrounds with different educations and social standings. Here, I present a table detailing these recorded appearances. Aside from the appearance of the 500, the number of unique witnesses goes up as high as 21.
Remember, Than is trying to answer the question as to whether the Bible could be lying or mistaken, but all of his references are from the very books he's attempting to corroborate. Does it mean anything at all to say Narnia is real? Because look at this list of 21 characters who saw Narnia firsthand. The Gospels and the Creeds and Acts are stories about potential witnesses. They are not the testimony of the witnesses. Stories about witnesses are equally susceptible to be lying or mistaken. It doesn't matter if the stories are about 21, 521, or 1,021,021.
As Dr. Lydia McGrew says in a 2020 article, when we get into the details, we see clear marks of some independence in the accounts. Their testimonies are not bare assertions that the event happened. They include details that interlock with each other, suggesting credibility, and they include details that others do not, which suggests some sort of independence. These combined factors bolster the credibility of the testimony and are evidence against collusion.
Than is establishing nothing here. Than has lumped some appearance narratives together here based on very loose themes, but there's no corroboration beyond motif. Again, if the Gospels could be lying or mistaken about the resurrection, the question you're attempting to answer, then they can also be lying or mistaken about group appearances. Actual group appearances are not the only explanation for stories of group appearances.
Moving on, we have the conversion of Paul. Because of the reliability of Acts, we can have confidence that this is Paul's actual testimony.
It's incompetent, irrelevant, and immaterial, in that it assumes a fact not in evidence.
Well, that's strange. We have at least 7 books of Paul's actual testimony. Why wouldn't we prefer that to a second-hand at best book that seems to be in conflict with Paul's testimony? Strange move. But we need not spend much time on Paul here, if Than is professing gospel reliability. Whatever form Jesus' resurrection body was, it left the earth at Pentecost, years before Paul's vision. Now, in the story of the Transfiguration, told in all 3 synoptic Gospels, Peter, James, and John are said to have witnessed long-dead Old Testament figures, Moses and Elijah, physically interacting with Jesus. This is not put forth as evidence that Moses or Elijah had rose from the dead. In Christian lore, people who died years ago can appear to live people without coming back to life. If that's true of Moses and Elijah, it's true of Jesus. So Paul's encounter with Jesus doesn't tell us that he resurrected.
If they were going to make something up, why make something up that they knew would cost them socially and physically with no earthly reward? Indeed, many of those who claim to have witnessed the risen Jesus not only anticipated a hostile reception, but also willingly endured suffering and even death for their belief in the resurrection.
Who says they made it up? I can concede that Paul, our only first-hand resurrection appearance account, wasn't making it up. I can also concede that one earlier believer sincerely experienced something. Beyond that, we have no reliable evidence that anyone in a position to know was making claims that caused them to suffer or die. Again, this is
objection, not in evidence.
Sustained.
Finally, let's get into our main points now. Remember the questions we needed to answer. What is the prior probability of the resurrection of Jesus? What are the odds of the evidence if the resurrection happened? And what are the odds of the evidence if the event did not occur?
perfect. Let's take a look at the list of evidence about gospel reliability that Than thinks is best explained by a man rising from the dead. 100 years after being written, the church agrees about who wrote them. One gospel uses financial terms. One gospel has regional familiarity. One gospel focuses on Peter. One gospel uses medical terms, read as if they were based on testimony. Unrelated segments of a different book use first-person language. Unrelated details of a different book are consistent with time and place. Character names are appropriate for time and place. They contain stories of at least 21 different people seeing Jesus. Someone check and see if I left anything out. No? That's it? That's all. These are the facts that are so mind-blowing, only a human resurrection can explain them.
This is exactly what we'd expect to see if Jesus had risen from the dead. But now ask yourself this. How likely would it be to see these things if Jesus was dead?
Are these facts equally, or better, explained by viewing the Gospels as evangelical tools that merely codify decades of oral tradition about Jesus? Yes, people can mistakenly agree. Yes, false narratives can use financial terms. Yes, false narratives can include regional details. Yes, even more so if the false narratives began with mistaken Peter. Yes, false narratives can use medical terms. Yes, authors of false narratives can use first-person language in other narratives. Yes, authors of false narratives can include factual details in other narratives. Yes, false narratives can include appropriate names. Yes, false narratives can include false tales of corroborating witnesses. Please consider me incredibly underwhelmed. That's it. This is Than's whole case. These are the facts that he thinks overcome the very low prior probability of a resurrection. It was merely dressed up in 25 minutes of math equations, quotes from people who agree with him, and a curious, repeated strategy of treating the Gospels as self-corroborating.
Now, I want to say this. If Matt wants to interact with this argument...
1 minute.
If Matt wants to interact with this argument, or anybody that wants to say the conclusion is not true, the objector must do one of or a combination of the following things. Argue that the prior for the resurrection is so low that the evidence can't overcome it.
My prior for the resurrection is low, but high enough that sufficient evidence can overcome it.
Attack the data itself.
I trust I've done this. The only actual data presented is this list.
Attack the explanation of the data by giving a better one.
I've also done this. The Gospels, as codification of decades of evolving oral tradition, is not only scholarly backed, but by Occam's razor, it has fewer assumptions because I don't need to posit anything supernatural.
So if these things are not met by the end of the debate, we can reasonably conclude that the resurrection is the best explanation of the data. Thank you for your time.
This data here, this list requires no resurrection at all to explain. Sorry. But speaking of no resurrection required, I recently put forth a 12-minute summary of the minimal witnesses explanation of Christian origins that addresses far more actual facts than were brought up in this opening statement. Tap on the thumbnail on screen now, and I'll see you over there. Until next time, later.